Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Part 4 of Chapter 6. Weapons of the Ayubid Army. The ongoing state of war with the Crusader invaders which affected the region, particularly Greater Syria, led to the establishment of an active war industry, especially since this region had abundant supplies of some of the necessary raw materials, as well as many skilled artisans. Greater Syria was known for the wide availability of timber from the thick mountain forests, especially pine trees, various types of oak, beech and other trees. However, the region was known for its scarcity of iron, but the rulers, especially Salah ad-Deen, compensated for this shortfall by importing iron from Italy and elsewhere. Iron was found only in a few areas of Syria and Mosul, and it is most likely that this iron was still being mined at the time of the Crusades, whether by the Muslims or the Crusaders, when they occupied this area. In addition to that, the region of Mosul was rich in tar, and in the naphtha that was needed for the naphtha throwers. Mosul supplied Salah ad-Din from time to time with whatever its land and artisans could give. It sent him loads of white naphtha, shields and spears, yielding the best and finest of each type. Egypt was rich in various kinds of wood, which was used in shipbuilding. With regard to the kinds of goods used, they were as follows. 1. Individual or light weapons such as the sword, the dagger, the spear, the axe, the mace, the bow, and the slingshot. 2. Heavy weapons such as the naphtha and fire thrower, or weapons operated by a group such as the mangonel, the testudo, and the like. 3. Armor, like the head covering worn under the helmet, the iron helmet, the coat of mail and the horse's coat of mail, were worn to protect the body. These items were worn by the knight or horseman, and he clothed his horse likewise, for protection against being burned by fire. And 4. There was also the mutallatat, which means triangles, a small tool made of iron or wood in the shape of a triangle, with sharp edges, and so on. The Ayubid Navy. Salah ad-Din's strategy changed after he moved from Syria to Egypt and found areas of weakness in the latter. He began to fortify its cities, build citadels, and organize the army to prevent the possibility of attacks against it. At that time, he focused on building up naval forces because he was aware of the strength of the Franks at sea and their weakness on land, and he realized that it was essential to build a war fleet to blockade the Frankish naval convoys, which were supplying the Crusader kingdoms on the Syrian coast with food, weapons, and men every time the pressure against them on land increased. At that time, Salah ad-Din discovered that the structure of the state in Egypt was weak and vulnerable, so he had no option but to reorganize its legislative and administrative affairs before starting to confront the Franks. Here it is essential to point out two matters that Salah ad-Din dealt with in addition to building a war fleet and fortifying the walls and the citadels. Firstly, Salah ad-Din realized the importance of keeping the trade and transportation routes between the Mediterranean and Red Sea open. And secondly, He recognized the difference between the interests of the merchants of the Mediterranean European cities and the ambitions of the rulers of the Latin kingdoms in Central and Northwestern Europe. So he signed trade agreements with them in return for their breaking their ties with the coast of Syria and Palestine. He also recognized the possibility that trade caravans might be exposed from the rear, as well as the possibility that the Hajj caravans might also be exposed to danger. Hence he ordered that his army be sent to Yemen to secure the sea lanes and put an end to pirate activity and attacks against the pilgrim caravans. Activities of the Ayubid Navy. The researcher may note that the Ayubid Navy went through three stages. The initial stage. In this stage, which we may call the preparatory stage, when the foundations were laid for the Ayubid fleet in Egypt, Salah ad-Deen carried out a number of reforms. He reorganized the fleet, setting up for it a separate department under his brother's supervision, giving him the authority to take whatever raw materials he required, and to recruit the men he needed. Thus the new state acquired a fleet that was able, with support from the land forces, to defend the borders of Egypt, starting from 565 Hijri, that is 1168 or 1169 Common Era. The fleet continued to grow, and by 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era, its numbers had multiplied to include 60 men of war and 20 lighter ships. The men of war in particular entered Byzantine territory and harassed the Frankish coast, capturing 1,000 non-Muslims and bringing them as captives in chains, and killing the senior officers. The stage of Ayubid naval strength in Egypt. This stage lasted from 1180 Common Era and ended at the beginning of 1183 Common Era, nearly 4 years. During this period, the Ayubid fleet managed to carry out a number of war operations against the Crusader fleet and to repel attacks launched by the enemy. Once the number of ships had increased and the resolve for jihad grew strong. The first war operation carried out by the Ayubid fleet was its confrontation with the enemy in a naval battle in 1180 Common Era, in which it achieved victory and managed to capture a large Crusader ship, with which they brought 1,000 prisoners. This naval victory was accompanied by the Ayubid army's victory in the Battle of Bait al-Ahzan, so there was victory on both land and sea. It was no coincidence that the Ayubid forces achieved these two victories at the same time, because Salah ad-Deen's victories started coming so swiftly that the Crusaders could not keep up with him, and he was not content only with defeating the enemy, destroying Bait al-Ahzan, and raiding Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, but he ordered the fleet to go out a second time from Egypt to attack Acre, the Constantinople of Syria, as Al-Qadi al-Fadil put it. They managed to capture numerous Crusader ships and started destroying, breaking, and scuttling them. This was something the like of which the Islamic fleet had never done before, not even when Islam was strong and disbelief was weak. Perhaps the greatest and most resonant victory was that which Salah ad-Deen's fleet achieved in the Red Sea in Shaban 578 Hijri, that is the autumn of 1182 Common Era. The Crusader commander Renaud de Chatillon took advantage of the fact that Salah ad-Deen was preoccupied with the siege of Mosul and launched a huge venture that had several aims, including gaining control of the Red Sea, attempting to cut off the two holy sanctuaries, and trying to persuade the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia to take part in the Crusades. Renaud attempted to gain control of the Red Sea by occupying Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba, and Aizab on the southern Egyptian coast, overlooking the sea. His targets included Jeddah and Rabil on the Arabian coast, from whence he planned on occupying Aden. Thus the waters of the sea would be at the mercy of the crusaders, and in this way they would gain control of the trade routes. Then they would reach the waters of the Indian Ocean. Renaud also planned to cut off the two holy sanctuaries, the heart of the Muslim world, from the rest of the Muslim lands, whether by land or by sea. This attempt was aimed as an act of provocation against all the Muslims, and at sending a wave of panic and fear among them. The Crusaders even resolved to enter Medina and take the body of the noble Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from his tomb. Renaud de Chatillon hopes to persuade the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia to take part in the Crusades. Renaud made preparations to carry out his naval venture. He ordered that the forests in the area under his control be cut down. He cut down the palm trees of Al-Arish, and he made ships from the wood, which he tested in the waters of the Dead Sea. He also asked the Crusaders of Ascalon to make more ships, until he had a fleet formed of 5 large ships and a large number of medium-sized and small ships. Then his men transported the ships in pieces to the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, carried on the backs of hired camels belonging to the local Bedouin, after he tempted them with money. Renaud sent a land army to Tabuk to block any military reinforcements that the ruler of Eilat might summon from Syria or Egypt. Renaud de Chatillon traveled by sea and headed towards Eilat. It fell to him after a brief resistance. His forces were unable to occupy the citadel, Jazirat Firon, known as the island of Pharaoh, but they prevented its people from acquiring water, so they suffered intense hardship, according to Ibn al-Athir. The remaining ships of the fleet continued to raid the African coast, attacking everything that crossed their path until they reached Aizab, where they captured merchant ships laden with goods that had come from Yemen and other areas such as India and Aden. The Muslims panicked when they saw the Crusader ships roaming the Red Sea, because it had never happened that they saw any Franks in that area, whether merchants or fighters. The Crusaders did terrible things, such as burning nearly 16 Muslim ships. They captured a ship carrying pilgrims and burned food supplies that were being sent to Mecca and Medina. This was in addition to killing and capturing people and other atrocities that they carried out on land and sea. From Aizab, the Crusaders set out for the eastern shore of the Red Sea, that is the Hijaz, where they set fire to the ships anchored at Al-Hawra and Janbu, the 2 ports of Medina. Then they penetrated further south until they reached Rabil, one of the ports of Mecca, near which they sank a pilgrim ship that was heading towards Jeddah. This news reached Salah ad-Deen in a letter that was sent by the man in charge of the citadel of Eilat, who was staying in Mosul. The Sultan sent word to his brother and deputy in Egypt, Al-Malik al-Adil Abu Bakr, urging him to take the necessary steps to respond to the aggressors as soon as possible. It seems that Al-Malik al-Adil was already preparing for this mission before the request of his brother the Sultan reached him. He ordered the admiral of the fleet, Husam ad-Din Lu'lu, to get ready for a military campaign. Husam ad-Din constructed a fleet in the cities of Fustat and Alexandria, then dismantled the ships and carried them on camels to the coast of Gulf of Suez. The ship pieces were accompanied by Maghrebi fighters, who then reassembled them. The Admiral Husam ad-Din Lu'lu divided the ships of his fleet into 2 groups. The first headed towards the citadel of Eilat and captured all the enemy ships, killing most of those on board, apart from a few who managed to escape and hide in the mountain passes and valleys. The admiral sent his men after them. They found them and finished them off like an eagle swooping down on its prey. As for the second group, he sent them towards Aithab, but they did not find any of the enemy there. So they started to search for the enemy fleet and found one ship near Al-Hawra. They disembarked from their ships and started fighting them, pursuing any who fled. They captured 170 of them and freed the Muslim prisoners. Then they captured their ships and the goods on board. The admiral returned with his victorious fleet to Egypt, bringing the prisoners with their legs in irons. Their entry into Alexandria on 1st Zulhijjah, 578 Hijri, that is 1183 Common Era, was a great day that coincided with the arrival of the famous traveler Ibn Jubair to that city. He saw a crowd of people who had gathered to watch the Crusader prisoners being brought into the city riding on camels, facing backwards to the sounds of drums and flutes. Al-Malik al-Adil ordered that they be beheaded and that none of them be left alive, so that no one would be able to tell the route to that sea or any other information about it. Some Sufi men, scholars and prominent religious figures took on the task of executing them. As it says in the letter of Al-Qazi al-Fadil to the court of the Caliph in Baghdad, there was no question about these disbelievers being executed. There was no Sharia justification for keeping them alive, and no interest to be served by doing so. Let us be resolved to kill them so that no others like them would dare to do their deeds again. Their actions were so terrible. Islam had never seen the like before. It so happened that it was Hajj season, so the Muslims took some of the prisoners to Mina to slaughter them like the sacrificial animals. The success of Salah ad-Deen's fleet in responding to the Crusader raid was a very bitter experience for the raiders. More than any other incident, it contributed to increasing the fame of Salah ad-Deen and strengthening his position among Muslims. It also increased the fame of the admiral, Usam ad-Din Lu'lu. As for the leader of the Crusader campaign, Renaud de Chatillon, he managed to escape captivity and return to his fortress at Kirak, like a wounded wolf licking its wounds, to continue planning his aggression against the Muslims. But Salah ad-Din announced that he would never forgive him for his attempt to violate the two holy sanctuaries, and he vowed to take revenge on him himself. Neither this Crusader ruler nor any other Crusader leader was able to repeat this bitter experience in the Red Sea, which remained a Muslim sea. Perhaps the last action undertaken by Salah ad-Din's navy during this period was when it set out at the beginning of 579 Hijri, that is 1183 Common Era, and traveled far into the Mediterranean to look for Crusader ships. They found a large ship carrying 375 fighters and their weapons. It was heading towards the occupied Syrian coast, carrying wealth and weapons. The Muslims fought them and both sides stood firm for a while. Then the Muslims were victorious. They captured the remaining crew and took them and the booty back to Egypt. The stage after Hattin until the Treaty of Ramlah, from 583 to 588 Hijri. After the decisive victory of Hattin, Salah ad-Din's army continued to achieve victories on various fronts, conquering the border posts and fortresses in northern Syria, Palestine, and the Jordan Valley. But the activity of the fleet remained below the level required in military operations, and its role in helping to reduce the land army's heavy burden of fighting to conquer the coastal cities was limited. This was not the result of weakness on the part of the Ayubid Navy, so much as the result of the strength of the Crusader navy. Salah ad-Din was aware of this difference and did not want his fleet to play a major role. In addition to that, he was worried about the attacks that the enemy might launch on the Egyptian coast, if he sent all his naval forces to the Syrian coast. Hence we see that the land army did not conquer inland citadels and fortresses only, but it also conquered coastal cities such as Acre, Beirut, Ascalon, Latakia, and others. Nonetheless, this did not prevent his fleet from undertaking some missions to support his army. In Tyre, things grew very difficult for Salah ad-Deen's army, as they were fighting on three fronts: the besieged city with its fortified walls, the northern front and the southern front surrounding the city. Thus the crusaders found them an easy target for arrows from their ships, which were anchored on both sides of the place where the Muslims were fighting the people in the city. They shot at and wounded the Muslims from their port, and their arrows also reached from one side to the other because the place was so narrow. Many Muslims were killed or wounded, but they could not get near the city. Salah ad-Din soon sent for the Egyptian men of war anchored off the coast of the recently conquered city of Acre, and these ships arrived in the nick of time. The Muslims were able to get close to the walls of the city, and they fought on land and sea, putting pressure on the enemy, and it was expected that the city would fall after that. For these reasons, the mission that was given to the fleet was of particular importance. One of its tasks was to blockade the port and prevent any help reaching the crusaders in Tyre by sea. Because of this, the fighters inside the city could not hold out for long. However, the Muslims grew a little careless in carrying out their mission of preventing crusader ships from getting close to Tyre. Whilst 5 ships of the Ayubid Navy were on guard to prevent the crusaders from entering or leaving Tyre, they thought that everything was under control. The guards felt safe and went to sleep just before dawn, and the men of the Crusader Navy took this opportunity to attack them. They killed whomever they wanted to kill, took the rest in their ships, and brought them into the port of Tyre, as the men of Salah ad-Din's army on land were watching. The commander of the Muslim fleet was Abdus Salam al-Maghribi, whom Ibn al-Athir described as proficient in his work and courageous, and Badran al-Farisi was with him. Some of the sailors who had been captured in their man of war whilst they were asleep managed to throw themselves into the sea, and some of them swam and were saved, but others drowned. As for the remaining 5 men of war, the Sultan asked their captains to head towards Beirut, because he could not benefit from their presence as they were too few, so they left, but the crusader ship pursued them, and all the Muslim sailors and fighters on board threw themselves from the ships onto the land. Thus they saved themselves and abandoned their ships. Salah ad-Din did not allow these ships to fall into crusader hands, however. He ordered a number of his men to go out and scupper them. Then he returned to fighting Tyre on land. As was to be expected, the Sultan was saddened by this disaster, and the disbelievers rejoiced at this strike. Thus the Ayubid fleet failed to take part in the battle for one of the coastal cities in Crusader hands. This operation was the only one undertaken by this fleet in this arena, and it was not repeated in the conquest of other cities. But it may be noted that the fleet resumed its activities during the lengthy Crusader siege of Acre, to help the city withstand the siege and supply it with much-needed weapons, food, and fighters. The most important naval reforms of Salah ad-Din. In order to revive the navy in Egypt, Salah ad-Din undertook a number of reforms as follows. Requisitioning the forests of Egypt. The forests of Bassana, Safat, Ashmunin, Asyut, Akhmim, and Kous were especially sought after. The value of a single plank of wood was 100 dinars, according to Al-Makrizi. According to this edict, no one was allowed to deal in trees, so that their timber might be used. This edict remained in effect until the end of the Ayubid era in Egypt, despite the neglect of the navy. In this regard, Uthman Ibrahim an-Nabulsi, who was a contemporary of the Ayubid state in Egypt, mentioned that the forests came under the same ruling as metals, which was that they belonged to the treasury of the Islamic State, and no one had any right to ownership of them, with no exceptions. This law also applied to other necessary materials, which the state also imported from elsewhere, especially iron and timber, which were needed to build ships. The Ayubid state had connections and trade relations with the Italian republics, by means of which it acquired what it needed of these two raw materials. What confirms the application of this law concerning these materials is what was stated by the Egyptian historian mentioned above, An-Nabulsi, that all timber, iron, lead, and other types of material were brought to Egypt by sea, and they were sold to the Naval Department nearly at cost. The department bought them in order to build men of war and other kinds of ships, as well as for building construction and making stockpiles of weapons. In Alexandria, there was a department called the Sultan's Store, whose role was to buy imported goods needed by the state for military purposes, especially those needed for building ships. The men in charge of the store bought these goods with the assets from the war tax which was imposed on merchants. In addition to what we have mentioned in building his fleet, Salah ad-Deen also made use of the pines and cedars that grew in the forests of Lebanon, and the iron which was mined in the mountains of Lebanon near Beirut. If this is true, then this happened after those regions were regained by the Muslims after 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era. Salah ad-Din establishes the Naval Department. In order to fund the Naval Department, he allocated for its expenses the land tax of Fayoum and its environs, and the land tax of Al-Barr al-Sharqi and Al-Barr al-Gharbi. Al-Barr al-Sharqi included the areas of Hattin, Amiriya and Minya, and Al-Barr al-Gharbi included the areas of Safad, Nahya, and Wasim al-Basatin outside Cairo. He also allocated for this purpose the yield of Natrun, which at that time was estimated at 8,000 dinars per year, as well as whatever zakah funds were acquired in Egypt, which was more than 50,000 dinars, in addition to the fees collected from government boats. Raising living standards of sailors and workers. Salah ad-Din paid attention to raising the living standards of the sailors and shipyard workers and those involved in connected industries, so as to improve their situation and encourage people to join the navy and work in shipbuilding. It was decided that a dinar of the fleet would be equivalent to 3/4 of a dinar, after it had previously been 5/8. In other words, it was an increase of 17.5% on its previous value. Appointment of leaders for the fleet. Salah ad-Din appointed important military personnel to lead the fleet. Although the sources do not mention the names of those who worked in the administration of Ayubid naval affairs in the early years of Ayubid history, apart from the name of the prominent commander, Husam ad-Din Lu'lu, who was famous for repelling the attack of Reynal du Chatillon, as we have seen above, and the names of a few ship's captains such as Yaqub al-Halabi, Jamal ad-Din Muhammad ibn Arkakaz, Badran al-Farisi, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, Abdus Salam al-Maghribi, and others. The fact that Salah ad-Din appointed his brother al-Malik al-Adil head of the navy in later years definitively points to the extent of his concern for the naval department. When al-Malik al-Adil began his work, He appointed Safi ad-Deen Abdullah ibn Ali ibn Shukr to be his deputy in supervising the administration of the fleet. Salah ad-Din granted the commander of the fleet far-reaching authority to carry out naval missions. After Salah ad-Din had finished preparing the fleet in 572 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, he wrote to all lands saying, "The one in charge of the fleet was full authority and should not be prevented from taking his men and whatever he needs." And he ordered the commander of the fleet not to leave the sea. Fortifying the borders. Salah ad-Din paid a great deal of attention to fortifying the borders. He decided to carry out large-scale operations at different times to maintain and refurbish towers and walls and dig ditches around them. He allocated large amounts of money to this mission and appointed men who were qualified to implement these plans, such as Bahauddin Karakush, to whom he entrusted the mission of renewing and building many military installations and other projects. Salah ad-Din visited to inspect and oversee fortifications and construction projects that were going on in the cities on the Mediterranean coast, especially at Alexandria and Damietta, and also Tanis. Following his return from his first journey to Syria, he set out in Shaban 572 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, with his two sons, Al-Malik al-Afzal Ali and Al-Malik al-Aziz Uthman, as well as Al-Isfahani, the well-known historian, and went via Damietta, where he saw how the work was progressing and saw precautions being taken. In 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era, Salah ad-Din appointed troops to man the two towers that stood at either ends of the city facing the sea, and he ordered that the boats be chained together so that the defenders of the city might fight on them if the enemy managed to penetrate between the two towers. In the same year, he also ordered that the walls of Damietta be refurbished and the holes in them repaired. Later on, Salah ad-Din ordered that the ditch of Damietta be dug and a bridge be built near the chain of the tower. Then he left Damietta and went to Alexandria, where, as the historian said, the Sultan refurbished the encircling wall. He did not leave before he had issued instructions that its border posts be completed and the fleet developed. This was the second inspection visit that he made to Alexandria. He made a third and final visit to Alexandria in 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era, to see the walls that had been refurbished and the construction work that he had initiated, and ordered that it be completed. Among the fortifications that Salah ad-Din ordered, built in Alexandria during this visit, was when he ordered Fakhruddin Karaja to break up 400 Roman columns, which surrounded the lighthouse, and place them on the shoreline. This was possibly to prevent enemy boats from reaching the port, or to reduce the strength of the waves against the wall of Alexandria. Encouraging men to join the navy. Salah ad-Din encouraged men to join the navy and brought in qualified elements from outside Egypt. His attempt succeeded because of the enticements offered to them by the Navy Department, or because of the spirit of jihad in the Muslims' hearts, which urged them to volunteer and work in the fleet, so that those who served in the fleet were called mujahideen, fighting for the sake of Allah against the enemies of Allah, and people sought blessing from their supplications. Salah ad-Din himself set a brilliant example of jihad. His historian Ibn Shaddad, who had seen a great deal of the terrors of the sea, said that Salah ad-Din turned to him one day when they were talking and said to him, "I am thinking that if Allah enables me to conquer the rest of the coast, I will divide the land give my last instructions, and bid farewell. Then I will travel by sea to their islands, and pursue them there until there is no one left on the face of the earth who disbelieves in Allah, or I will die. The role of the Maghrebis in the Muslim fleet. The Maghrebis were the ones who responded most to Salah ad-Deen's call to work in the navy. They were the ones on whom he relied in preparing the Egyptian fleet, to such an extent that it became their exclusive preserve, according to al-Makrizi, because they were well acquainted with the ways of the sea. It is known that the Maghrebis became very famous in the East, especially in terms of naval jihad, because of their skill in piloting ships and navigation, and in the arts of naval warfare. Hence they were known as the Knights of the Sea from an early stage, and the Fatimids, Ayubids, Mamluks and Ottomans all sought their help in the administration of their fleets. The traveller Ibn Jubair states that the naval campaign led by Husam ad-Din Lu'lu against the Crusaders in the Red Sea at the time of Salah ad-Din involved a large number of Maghrebi naval heroes. Perhaps the greatest evidence of the Maghrebis specializing in naval affairs at that time is that Salah ad-Din sent his envoy Abdurrahman ibn Munqidh to the ruler of the Maghreb, Yaqub al-Mansur al-Muwahhidi, asking him for naval help to attack the Crusader posts in Syria. Despite the reports that al-Mansur refused Salah ad-Din's request because he did not address him in his letter as Amir al-Mu'minin, in other words, he did not acknowledge the al-Muwahhid Caliphate. The Maghrebi historian as-Salawi an-Nasiri suggests that al-Mansur sent Salah ad-Din 180 warships to keep the Crusader ships away from the Syrian coast. Maghrebi participation in the jihad against the Crusaders in Egypt and Syria took place on both land and sea. In this regard, we find a great deal of material in biographies and accounts of journeys which describe their actions and exploits, and mention the names of those who were martyred and buried there in Palestine. It is sufficient to refer in particular to the Andalusian traveller Ibn Jubair, who visited Egypt and Syria. This Maghrebi traveller has given us valuable information about the activities of the Maghrebi Mujahideen in the Crusades. For example, he refers to the additional tax that was imposed by the Crusaders in Syria only on Maghrebi merchants and not on other Muslim merchants. The reason for that was because a number of Maghrebi heroes fought alongside the Sultan Nuruddin Mahmud Zangi and captured one of the Crusader fortresses after a display of rare and exemplary courage. So the Franks punished them by imposing an additional tax of 1 dinar on every Maghrebi merchant who passed through their colonies in Syria. This was in addition to the taxes paid by other Muslim merchants as a penalty for their courage. Ibn Jubair also speaks of the interest taken by Muslim kings, wealthy men and rich ladies in ransoming Maghrebi prisoners because they were far from their homeland. This was in addition to the many endowments that were set up for Maghrebis who settled in Syria. The Maghrebis played a noble role in jihad. They were always in touch with their brothers in the East in both good times and bad, in the fields of knowledge and of jihad. They offered their fighting expertise to their Eastern brothers at the time of the Zangids and Ayubids, and they did not withhold their military capabilities from the Ayubids. They used them to confront the Crusader fleets. This shows us that the Muslim peoples were always interacting with one another and joining forces under the banner of Islamic jihad whenever the Ummah was exposed to danger. One of the important lessons we learn from this is that of the Muslims overcoming by means of their religion and beliefs the constraints of narrow-minded nationalism and tribalism. Nuruddin was a Turk, Salah ad-Deen was a Kurd, Yusuf ibn Tashfin was a Berber, and the Abbasid Caliph was an Arab. But they all formed a united front under the banner of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Protecting the holy places against Crusader aggression was regarded as the most important task of the Ayubids during their rule. We could say that Salah ad-Din managed to form a land army and naval fleet that was equipped with everything that it needed for fighting in terms of weapons, equipment, and supplies, thanks to this wise policy that he followed in organizing his army, which spread the spirit of Islamic jihad in their hearts. He implemented a system of military fiefs in his state, through which it was possible to guarantee the availability of an organized army, which was supplied with everything it needed. This army played a part in achieving Muslim unity and paving the way for the jihad venture, which was aimed at eradicating the Crusader presence in Syria. There was no obstacle left to prevent Salah ad-Din from focusing on jihad against the Crusaders and taking back Jerusalem, except unifying the internal front. This is what we will find out about in the next chapter, Insha'Allah. End of part 4 of chapter 6. End of chapter 6.